Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar, Hot Topics in Education 2015, brought to you by NCSL. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode to provide favorable sound quality during today's presentation. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Julie Davis-Bell. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's NCSL Hot Issues webinar. This is a series of webinars that NCSL is doing, and today we're going to be focusing on some of the important education issues facing state legislatures in 2015. Since states have the primary responsibility to provide education, and since on average states spend about 50% of their budget on education, education issues are always high on legislative agendas. 2015 will be no different. Today I am joined by 6 of NCSL's education policy experts. While we will only have time to quickly introduce you to some of the important issues we are watching in the states, we will have time at the end of the presentations for some questions. But if we haven't answered your question, or if you want more information, feel free to contact us. And our contact information is available for you on the very last slide of this presentation. If you have questions during the presentation, please feel free to enter them in the chat box at the bottom left-hand corner. I also want to let you know that a PDF version of this presentation is available to you, and you will be able to find that at the media library box next to that microphone. You'll see a yellow piece of paper with a blue graph on it, and that's where you'll be able to get the PDF version of this presentation. I want to introduce our speakers to you now, and again, contact information for them is provided on our final slide. Daniel Thatcher has closely tracked state activity on the design and implementation of state college and career readiness standards. And as you can imagine, that task keeps him very busy. He has the up-to-the-minute latest information on state activity related to academic standards. Michelle Ekstrom is also closely watching the standards discussions, as well as conversations about testing and assessments. Michelle will bring you up to date on some of the issues states are looking at here, including student data privacy. Sunny DA covers our digital and technology issues, and concerns about data privacy are also embedded in this work and are emerging as urgent issues for states to tackle. Dustin Whedon and Suzanne Hulteen work on post-secondary issues. Dustin has been following trends in higher education appropriations, tuition, and financial aid. Dustin and Suzanne are tracking a range of policies intended to help more students and citizens complete a quality post-secondary credential or degree. Finally, Lee Posey in our Washington, D.C. office is watching carefully what Congress and the administration are up to regarding reauthorization of the ESEA and other education policies. Let's begin. I'll turn things over to Dan Thatcher.
Thank you very much, Julie, and I appreciate you saying that this information that I'll be presenting is up to the date, up to the minute, because indeed, right as I left here to come present this morning, I made an update to my chart tracking this legislation. So I do feel like I have the most up-to-date information on where we are at right now with states' implementation of college and career readiness standards and the Common Core state standards. So what you will see before you on your slide is a complicated map, but I will take a moment here to break it down and to illustrate what you see and what the different icons on there mean. If you have questions about any of this, please feel free to email me. Again, contact information will be on the final slide. So what you see before you is that there are 43 states in the United States that are currently, right now, implementing Common Core state standards in mathematics in classrooms, and then 44 states implementing the English language arts in classrooms. The difference is that Minnesota adopted only the English language arts. Now, the states that are colored in blue are the states that were former adopters of the Common Core State Standards, but as of today, in classrooms today in these two states, Common Core State Standards are not being implemented. And this was a result of legislative activity in 2014 and 2013. The states in orange, Missouri, North Carolina, and South Carolina, are in the process of replacing or reviewing the Common Core State Standards as directed by their state legislatures. Until their review is completed, the Common Core State Standards will be taught and are being taught in their classrooms today. Now, for the number of icons that you see here, the Common Core is being implemented as an iteration. And I use the word iteration because in 29 states, the states have rebranded or rebranded is a correct word to say because of changes, state-specific changes they have made to the Common Core. In another 9 states, the executive has taken action to set up mostly a review of the Common Core State Standards that will be led and is being led by the executive branch. In a handful of other states, there have been judicial challenges to either the adoption of Common Core State Standards or the related assessments. And only in Louisiana has there been a final disposition on one of those cases. For this, I'm not going to get into it. If you have more questions, please contact me later. Now, what's happening today in legislatures? As of a minute ago, I've been able to identify 39 bills in 19 states that would replace or completely halt statewide implementation of the Common Core State Standards. In 6 of those states, that bill has passed the first committee. And in 2 states, that bill has passed the first chamber and is now being reviewed by the, either the House or the Senate in those states. I have more information. If you contact me, I will be happy to get this to you. Because it's so new, I haven't have it in a good form to share quite yet, but I can get you the names of the states and bills if you would like. And with the standards, they are reviewed many times by legislatures hand in hand with assessments. My trusty colleague, Michelle Ekstrom, will now talk about the assessments that are associated with the Common Core State Standards.
Thank you, Dan. One of the hottest topics in 2014 and certainly for 2015 is the issue of student assessments. In 2014, states were still trying to determine which college and career ready assessments was best for their state, since students are set to take those exams beginning this spring in 2015. There have been quite a few states that have made changes to their assessment plans since they originally signed on to Park and Smarter Balance Consortia, including adopting another college and career ready assessment such as ACT Aspire, AIR, or others. States are continuing to discuss which assessment is best for their state. As you will see on this slide, this is the current state of where the states are at on the adoption of either Park, Smarter Balance, or another assessment. So for 2015, the issue of student assessments continues to be a very hot topic. Legislators are now considering whether states should actually opt out of annual statewide assessments and to what extent. About half of the states have actually introduced legislation along these lines, with about 75 total bills that we're watching currently. Those bills consider opting out of the current consortium, opting out of an annual English language arts and math assessment, allowing districts to opt out of the annual assessments, or allowing parents to opt their students out of these assessments. Of course, there are potential ramifications for enacting this kind of legislation, since this could be considered a violation of federal education law. The states are working through the ramifications right now of the potential legislation that they may eventually adopt. Another hot topic for both 2014 and certainly for 2015 is student data privacy. With changes to standards and assessments and more use of digital technology in the classrooms, legislators are growing more concerned that traditional policies that protect student data privacy, such as the federal FERPA law and others at the federal level, and their own state policies and practices, may not be enough to truly protect student data privacy in this day and age. While conversations continue at the federal level about whether there is a need for FERPA and other privacy laws to be changed in order to protect today's students, state legislators are putting in place legislation that would provide their own protection. So as you will see on this slide, in 2014, there were 130 bills considered in 36 states. 30 bills from 21 states were actually enacted. This was actually the first year that we saw a really large number of legislation of bills considered on this particular issue. 2013, we saw one bill enacted, and from there, it's become a really hot discussion in the states. We'll also see to the right on the slide some discussion about some categories of the types of legislation that's considered. Putting in place data security plans, protection of personally identifiable information, transparency, data governance structures, and creating a purpose statement so that the states and districts can communicate to parents and students and others why they collect student data and what it's used for. In 2015, we're seeing a lot of legislation around these same buckets of policy with regard to student data privacy, and we're actually seeing even more legislation than we saw last year. So as of early February, over 100 bills in over 30 states had already been introduced, nearly as much action as we saw in all of last year. So we do anticipate this to be another hot topic for state legislators in 2015. So now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Sunny DA, who will discuss a particular brand of student data privacy legislation that addresses digital learning and vendor contracts.
Thank you, Michelle. That's right. Late during the 2014 legislative sessions, conversations started to percolate around student data privacy in online learning spaces, including apps and online services developed for school-age kids. And while participation in online learning environments provides a variety of digital skills that are critical to student success, there are growing concerns that private tech companies are collecting too much data about individual students without safeguards for student data privacy. California was the first adopter of significant state legislation limiting the use of data collected through educational apps and other online media to very specific and limited use for educational purposes. California's legislation was unique in that it shifted responsibility for safeguarding student data from the schools contracting with online providers to the providers themselves, even those who don't contract directly with schools. And to date, at least 10 states have introduced similar legislation in the 2015 session. Also, a concurrent effort is being made by the tech companies themselves, with a growing number of them signing the Student Data Privacy Pledge, the voluntary effort to ensure that they are all following the same student data privacy standards. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Dustin.
Okay, thank you, Sunny. And I'm going to briefly highlight 4 areas of post-secondary affordability that we're seeing a lot of traction in state legislatures this session. So first of all, when discussing post-secondary education affordability, tuition is frequently the starting point because it represents the amount students and their families pay. This session, we're tracking 2 tuition trends that really stand out. First, several states have been able to freeze tuition levels in recent years due to improved budget situations. We're seeing this trend continue and become more formalized this year, with approximately 10 states considering bills for tuition freezes. Second, a growing number of state legislatures are placing tighter restrictions on tuition increases or contemplating taking control of setting tuition rates. Both Hawaii and Texas are currently considering legislation that would give each state's legislature the responsibility for setting tuition. In addition to tuition, financial aid represents one of the most direct tools legislatures have to influence affordability. Increasingly, states are turning to financial aid programs to help students graduate on time, saving students the cost of continued years of education. I want to briefly highlight 2 examples of bills under consideration in Washington and Ohio. Washington House Bill 2041 would establish a pilot program that would increase aid to students who meet certain performance thresholds, such as enrolling in 15 credit hours a semester. And in Ohio, House Bill 27 would establish a grant program that would help students who are near completion overcome the small random events that frequently derail students from completing their degrees in a timely fashion. In recent years, student loan debt has become a very hot topic as the number of students borrowing has increased steadily, but so has the amount per student borrowed. Legislators are becoming increasingly concerned about the negative effects this borrowing has on state economies and are considering actions to lessen the burden borrowed states. We're tracking more than 100 bills across the country that would do everything from provide tax credits for student loan debt to helping borrowers obtain home mortgages. Several states are considering even more aggressive actions, such as refinancing existing student loans and placing restrictions on private loan providers. And finally, free community college proposals have gained attention this year with President Obama's proposal for a federal-state partnership and Tennessee beginning to implement the state's new Promise Scholarship program. So far, at least 10 states have introduced legislation that would enable state residents to attend community colleges without paying tuition and fees. Most states would accomplish this objective by providing scholarships or waiving the amount of tuition not covered by other sources of financial aid. New York is somewhat unique with the state's proposal to reimburse students for out-of-pocket expenses after they have earned their credential or degree. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, who's going to talk more about post-secondary affordability.
Great, thank you, Dustin. As Dustin mentioned, he talked a little bit about some of the free community college proposals, which we realize may not be viable for every state, but there is growing interest in finding ways for students to earn college credits virtually free of charge. These programs have the capability of significantly reducing the cost of earning a credential while also encouraging completion. A lot of these initiatives stem from a workforce development need. Legislators are well aware that over 2/3 of all jobs in the next 5 to 10 years will require some sort of post-secondary credential, and finding ways to offer low to no cost post-secondary education can help fill the workforce gaps. Most common of these strategies are dual or concurrent enrollment, which are programs that offer college-level courses to high school students so that they can meet high school graduation requirements while also earning college credits. Career and technical education, or CTE programs, are also extremely common and typically offer the same benefits of dual enrollment courses. However, they are aligned with industry-recognized credentials. Last year, we saw policy actions in 46 states, either from the state legislatures or state boards of education, around increasing access and funding for CTE programs. And this year, at least 15 state legislatures have introduced similar legislation. Other strategies states are looking at is applying prior learning experience to degree requirements. And we most commonly find this in applying military experience, but we are also seeing actions to apply internships and work and apprenticeship experiences towards college credits. And then finally, states are looking into more ways to award credentials for students who have received some college credits but may not have enough to earn a bachelor's degree. Whether this means four-year universities granting associate's degrees or evaluating and updating transfer agreements between university and college systems to make sure no credits go to waste. So this is a quick overview of post-secondary, and now I'm going to hand it over to Lee Posey for a federal overview.
Thank you, Suzanne. I've been asked to give a brief update on activity in Washington, D.C. related to education. And certainly I want to note that there are a lot of higher education issues and data privacy issues that are being discussed in Washington as well as in the state. But the biggest educational news right now is the long, long overdue reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, commonly known as No Child Left Behind. And I wanted to discuss the different approaches that the Senate and the House are taking to this bill. The Senate Health, Education, and Labor, or HELP Committee, has kind of put the process on, slowed down the process a bit so that Chairman Lamar Alexander of Tennessee and Ranking Member Patty Murray of Washington State can have a chance to negotiate, perhaps, a bipartisan committee bill. They really wanted to try and move forward on a bipartisan process. It's not a foregone conclusion. Their discussions are focused on some pretty big issues, including accountability, assessments, and funding, but they wanted to make that effort. The House Education and the Workforce Committee has already acted. Chairman Klein's bill, H.R. 5, moved out of the committee on a straight-line party vote on the 11th of this month. This bill is very similar to the chairman's bill of the last Congress. This bill is kind of on a fast track. They're actually expecting to start the floor consideration of it Wednesday this week and perhaps finish as early as Friday. I say perhaps because I note on the slide that the clock is ticking. The biggest problem with getting ESEA reauthorization accomplished this Congress is simply that there are a lot of things that could derail the process because there wouldn't be floor time in the House or the Senate to consider such a long and complex piece of legislation. It's very apparent that congressional leadership does want to move this bill, but we're facing a number of upcoming flashpoints in Congress that have the potential to blow up Congress on some fiscal matters, which could make progress a lot slower. I'll just note a few. March 15th is the deadline for the reinstatement of the statutory debt limit. March 31st, there are a number of programs that have to be taken up, including the Medicare Doc Fix, Transitional Medical Assistance, Qualified Individuals Program. And then May 31st, when the Highway Trust Fund becomes insolvent and surface transportation programs have to be reauthorized. And that's not counting the fact that this is the week here in Washington where they have to deal with, Congress has to deal with the fact that funding will expire for Homeland Security. So a lot could happen. Most observers believe that action on the House and Senate floor to rewrite NCLB will be the opening act, that the House will pass a more conservative approach to education reform. The Senate could possibly put forward a more bipartisan approach. Ultimately, the main event is going to be the House and the Senate working behind closed doors to hammer out a compromise in the form of a conference committee bill that can be supported by 60 senators and signed by the president. So there's a lot of work still to be done. I did want to give you a taste of some of the things that are in the House bill, H.R. 5, as well as a discussion draft that Senator Alexander passed around in the Senate earlier before starting work on a bipartisan approach, because I think it will give you an idea of what ESEA reauthorization could look like. Both the House bill and the Senate discussion draft would lessen the federal role in education, let states set their own accountability standards, and decide how they're going to intervene in failing schools. Both would allow Title I dollars to follow the students into other public schools, and both would make changes to federal funding, and I'll speak a little bit more about that later. Both would repeal the maintenance of effort requirement for ESEA programs. That's the federal requirement that states maintain their level of spending in order to receive federal money. And both would end some of the discretionary programs and combine some of these grants into bigger funding streams. To talk a little bit more about the funding matters, H.R. 5 would eliminate more than 65 education programs, including the School Improvement Grants and the Striving Readers Literacy Program. The Senate would combine about 67 programs, including school improvement grants, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, school counseling, PE, into a school climate formula funding stream, and a teacher training, and then other programs into a teacher training stream. I did also want to mention that the concept of portability of Title I dollars is getting a lot of attention here in Washington. There was an amendment in the House committee that was withdrawn that would have allowed Title I to follow a child to private school, but that was withdrawn. And it's interesting, this issue is something that splits Democrats and Republicans, and frankly, it also splits the Republican caucus, and that's why the amendment was withdrawn. They didn't think they could go as far as portability that moved beyond public school. The last thing that I'll talk about is assessments. You've heard from my colleague Michelle Ekstrom what a hot topic assessments are in the states. The same issues are coming up here in Washington, D.C. They're hearing the complaints about over-testing, and there's a lot of frustration with No Child Left Behind's schedule of testing, as well as the associated federal requirements around testing. As you probably know, No Child Left Behind requires a total of 17 tests, math and reading tests annually in grades 3 through 8. These are statewide tests, and once in high school, and then 3 science tests, once in elementary, once in middle, and once in high school. When Senator Alexander drafted his Help Committee bill, he actually included two options that he wanted the committee to consider. One was to allow states to decide what testing schedule they thought was best and the mix of tests, local state assessments. The other was to maintain the current No Child Left Behind testing schedule. H.R. 5 sticks to the current No Child Left Behind testing schedule that I just mentioned, and this is in response to a lot of argument that it is an important accountability provision to have these annual statewide tests in many of the grades. So those are the big issues in play right now in ESEA reauthorization. As I said, action will probably be happening soon, and that's the best chance, frankly, for a reauthorization to be accomplished this Congress. The longer it drags on, the more chance there is the process will get derailed, and then we'll get close to another election season, and that will make things even more difficult. So on that very uncheerful note, I'd like to turn it back over to our moderator, Julie Bell.
Thank you, Lee. Well, that is our very, very quick tour of very important education issues that state legislatures are tackling and discussing in 2015 this year. We would really very much like to answer your questions, and so let me remind you that the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen is your place to ask something that you might want to ask one of our issue experts. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about some questions and put some in there while I have a few of my own that I'll kick off our question and answer portion of this webinar with. The first question I want to ask is for Dan, and it has to do with the volume of legislation that we're seeing in the state, the activity around college and career readiness standards. How does the activity you're watching right now this year compare to previous years?
Thank you, Julie. When I started tracking this in 2011, I identified around 40 bills that dealt with in some way, even if tangentially, the implementation of Common Core state standards. And over the year, that tracking has morphed into tracking legislation dealing with college and career readiness state standards to reflect different approaches states have taken to how to craft and identify the standards that they're implementing. And so, as I mentioned, 40 bills in 2011. In 2012, it grew to 140 bills. In 2013, 350-odd bills. Last year, we identified over 400 individual bills. And this year, we're at 450 bills, and we're only at the end of March. Now, to be clear, the type of legislation that we're tracking mostly would further implementation of the policies that are needed to be in place to support the standards, or policies that flow out of the implementation of the standards. For example, furthering providing the supports needed to implement computer adaptive assessments or online assessments that are aligned to the state standards. And that hasn't changed from this year. So the number of bills that we see that would repeal the adoption of Common Core state standards is about the same percentage of bills that we've seen in previous years.
Very, very helpful. Thank you very much. I also want to follow up with Michelle. You mentioned the state action versus federal action around student data privacy. And I know states are really trying to figure out what their role is here. Could you tell us whether states really need to enact student data privacy legislation, or is the federal law enough to provide the protections that we're looking for?
That's a great question, and that's a question we get a lot from state legislators. I think it's just important to keep in mind that state legislators play an important role in protecting data privacy in general in their state, whether it be for students or for adults, just generally in their commerce transactions. So legislators who are concerned that there may not be enough federal protections, or they don't want to take chances, certainly should consider putting something in place that may address some of the concerns that they're hearing, or concerns that are being brought up by their state departments of ed or local education agencies. It doesn't hurt to be duplicative in this effort. And so many of the legislators who have put legislation in place have said that they just don't want to take the chance. They don't want to rely on a federal policy scheme that really wasn't created at a time that could imagine what our current online activity or use of digital technology in the classrooms might be. So they're more comfortable putting legislation in place to ensure that someone in their state is looking out for student data privacy and is charged with the governance of student data privacy, and someone is ensuring that vendors and others have to meet certain expectations around the use of and their management of student data.
Great, thank you. That was perfect. Before we leave the standards and assessment discussion for a moment, I wanted to ask you if there are organizations that are evaluating how well the alignment is between new assessments and Common Core readiness standards. I know there's a variety of folks we're hearing about who are getting into this space, but I'm wondering what you can tell us about who's doing what and how we should think about that.
Again, this is another question that legislators have been asking us, especially last year as they were really trying to dive into what these assessments are and which option was best for their state. They wanted to know if anybody had really looked at them and validated them as what they are asserting to be the next generation assessments that will be the first to actually determine whether or not students are college and career ready. Thankfully, there is an effort underway by Fordham, and they are looking at the Smarter Balanced Assessment, the PARC Assessment, ACT Aspire, which is an assessment that a good number of states have opted for. And they're also looking at the old Massachusetts statewide assessment, MCAS. And they're looking at the 4 of those assessments to determine whether or not they really are a good measurement of college and career readiness and whether or not they really are aligned to the new Common Core and college and career ready state standards. They expect their study work to be finished up and to issue a report by September. So I think this will be something that legislators will want to look for. It will really be the first piece of research that we have to determine whether these are the right assessments for you and your state.
Perfect. Thank you.
Can I just chime in really quick just to make a quick clarification? Fordham, not Fordham University, but Fordham Institute, in case there's any lingering questions on it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Again, feel free to ask your questions over in the chat box. I've got just a couple more I want to present to our folks here around the table. I want to switch over to higher education for a moment and ask Dustin if he could fill us in on how state appropriations for higher ed are looking for 2015. This is always something that we watch go up and down every year, kind of depending on what's going on in the economy. But I'm wondering, Dustin, if you have some ideas about what the overall outlook is for higher education appropriations in this year.
Yeah, Julie, that's a great question because in addition to the financial aid and tuition policies I really highlighted earlier, state appropriations are really the primary means that states use to influence affordability. And as you mentioned, higher education appropriations tend to track state economies very closely. And in recent years, we've seen, and the states have rebounded from the Great Recession, their appropriations have rebounded very well, and higher education has been one of the, if not the top, increased spending category in those states. And so for the states that are continuing to see their tax revenues increase and maintain the level of growth they've had in the last couple of years, I think we'll continue to see higher education really be one of the top budget items in those states, or an increase over a previous year. Now, in states where the economy has been sluggish in the recovery, it's going to be tough for higher education to compete with all of the other budget priorities, and especially in the states that have rely heavily on oil revenues or energy resources. And with the price of those being down this spring, I think those states are really going to struggle with especially with their higher education appropriations this year.
Justin, I also wanted to ask you while we're on this topic, one of the hot issues in higher education funding that we've certainly been watching has been this interest in outcomes-based or performance-based funding. Could you just give us a quick update on where that stands in the states?
Yeah, absolutely. We're tracking about 34 to 35 states either have an outcomes-based funding formula in place or are actively transitioning to it. And I think what we've seen is really a slowdown of states that are transitioning to it, and really now the trend is really states are evaluating what they put in place and making tweaks or changes along the way to make sure that the formula is producing the goals that they want, in particular increasing the number of graduates with credentials or degrees and meeting those state workforce needs going forward. So really the trend is kind of shifting away from states adopting to states tweaking and really ensuring that their formulas are accomplishing the goals set out.
So the verdict is still out on how well it's working and what we know about how it's working. Great. It remains to be seen. I wanted to ask Suzanne if she could talk to us a little bit more about prior learning credit. We hear this a lot in the post-secondary discussion right now, and legislators particularly are really interested in this and how it might work and what it really looks like. But I wanted to ask Suzanne if she could talk about how this issue is evolving in the states. Is it something that state legislatures are designing legislation for, or is it something that we're seeing happen institution by institution?
Great. Thank you, Julie. Now, we originally saw prior learning assessments, and they're most commonly used for applying military experience. So any work and training and classes that people in the military earned and took while overseas or here in the United States, applying that experience towards a college credential or some sort of certificate is most commonly where we saw prior learning assessments. And that's where the majority of state legislation is around. However, we're seeing more and more states looking at applying other sorts of experience. So experience that students may have learned through an internship or some sort of apprenticeship or any other sort of on-the-job training, and applying that towards a college credential. So reducing the number of credit hours that a student needs to spend in the classroom, and also reducing the cost that that student needs to pay for earning that credential.
Okay, thanks. That's helpful. We have a question from Caitlin that Michelle is going to answer for us. And the question is, are we seeing an increase in bills about school vouchers and or charter school expansion?
Thanks, Julie. Yes, we are. This continues to be a hot topic as well. Over the past few years, we've certainly seen an increase in these types of bills, and as states continue to find ways to implement what we traditionally call voucher systems, tuition tax credits, there's other ways to categorize these types of programs. But as states are finding constitutional ways to implement these programs, more and more states are considering doing something similar. And we are also seeing states that may not necessarily have a statewide program, but are allowing school districts to create something similar. So we are certainly seeing an expansion of this. I know just in the past couple of weeks, I believe it's Alabama and Mississippi, and I'm not absolutely certain about that, but I'm pretty certain, have both voted to jump into the charter school realm. So those are two states that didn't have charter schools or had some sort of policy in place that was a barricade to implementation of charter schools. And so they have moved forward with allowing charter schools in their states. So I think more and more this is becoming the norm, and we're seeing more and more states move in these directions.
Great, thank you. We have a couple more minutes. If you've got some questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. Lee, what I would like to do is throw this back to you for a few minutes to see if there are some other federal activity that you're watching. I know when we talk about what the federal government is up to, we can go on for hours, and I thought there might be a couple other things you'd like to highlight that you didn't have a chance to mention in your earlier comments.
Certainly. Thanks, Julie. And let me mention something first that I didn't get to really bring up earlier, and that is on the SEA reauthorization, and you can find it on the NCSL website. The National Governors Association and NCSL have worked together on a comprehensive plan for reauthorization that we put out there as kind of a bipartisan marker, and we hope that it will be useful as work continues in Congress. But of course, there are other things happening. I think a lot of discussion on the recent teacher preparation regs. Comments on those were due at the beginning of this month. This was action that the administration took to write regulations regarding how states measured the performance of their teacher preparation programs, what were the indicators that they would have to use. They're required to report to the federal government on those, on the indicators they use to look at their programs under current law, but this went much further and furthermore tied performance on those indicators that the federal government would specify to an institution's ability to, a program's ability to offer federal teach grants to the students that might be in that program. So this was one of the regulatory efforts that we monitor here in DC, where a lot of policy gets made in the absence of legislation. The Higher Education Act reauthorization, which also should have been happening and hopefully will happen after ESEA, would, we think, be a better place to deal with some of these issues. The other thing I would mention is that following right along in those veins, the administration has put forward a plan to look at college rankings and how well the colleges are doing on certain indicators. And that one would require some changes in the federal student aid program that Congress is not likely to make. But it's all part of the administration's emphasis on college access and affordability, and represents what they think is a proper federal role for that. So that's been the subject of a lot of discussion. There is also one of the items in the President's budget proposal that was of great interest to people in the education field was more funding for preschool programs, and we will look and see what happens with that as the budget process moves forward. There is bipartisan support for additional funding for early education. Everyone realizes how important it is that when students come into first grade, they are actually ready to learn. But what this should look like, how much it will be, how well it will coordinate with existing state efforts, those are a couple of things that are still being discussed. So I think that those are a couple of the other things that we're following. We continue to work with groups here in Washington who are tracking what will happen at the federal level on student data privacy, and the possibility of a couple of bills in Congress that include a bill by Senators Markey and Hatch to update FERPA, the federal education law regarding student privacy, and also one that Representative Jared Polis and Representatives Polis and Luke Messer are planning that will be modeled very much along California's law and look at some of the vendors of educational software. So they're kind of parallel tracks as to what's happening in the states, and there's a lot of interest in making sure that any federal activity is complementary to what states are doing.
Thanks, Lee. That was perfect, and I really appreciate your comment about parallel tracks in the states, because many of the issues you just mentioned right there are other things that we are watching, that state legislators are working on, that they're struggling with, and that we certainly have information available for legislators, legislative staff, and others on our website. Things like the teacher prep discussion, things like college rankings, preschool and early learning, especially early reading and math, is something that we're hearing a lot from state legislators with interest about, and certainly work on school principals and how to make sure that there's a high-quality principal in every school. And on all of these issues, you are welcome to visit our website at www.ncsl.org/education. You'll find a database full of bills that state legislatures are passing. You'll find all sorts of background information on the topics we've discussed here and others as well. So I'd like to thank you all for joining us. I'd like to thank our staff for their work in putting this webinar together, and stay in touch with us. And if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to let us know. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have a great day.